Welcome to Advocacy and Building Coalitions for LGBTQ plus counselor allies. I'm Dominique N. Marslek. Today we'll be joined by Jean Dockery and Leo Can-Schneider. The ACA Government Affairs and Public Policy Department is happy to bring this presentation in celebration of Pride Month. ACA Government Affairs and Public Policy advocates on behalf of our members and the counseling profession on issues impacting various practice settings. ACA Government Affairs works to advance and ensure that licensed professional counselors enjoy seamless portability, ensure equitable, consistent, and adequate reimbursement for appropriately educated, trained, and licensed professional counselors in all practice settings, promoting holistic wellness, prevention, and empowerment for our counselors, advocating for initiatives that reduce the challenges and barriers faced by clients, students, counselors, and communities, advocating for adequate funding and initiatives for programs that support clients, students, counselors, and our communities. ACA Government Affairs works on two fronts for our members. We work with issue advocacy and legislative advocacy. Issue advocacy promotes a particular position on an issue. Legislative advocacy involves acting in order to support, discourage, amend, or pass legislation. What role do counselors play in this? When working with legislators, we really need counselors' expertise, not just on the ground and in regard to their community, but also just in defining what a counselor is in relation to a psychiatrist, psychologist, or social worker, what role counselors play in the behavioral health field, what are the ethical and educational standards for the counseling profession, and how do they interface with your work, and how your work impacts your clients, community, state, and national mental health trends. So in doing so, you can leverage your position with universities by utilizing newest data on best practices, as well as endorsements, public statements, physical space, and resources for coalition meetings. You can work with state executive offices, such as the State Licensing Board, local offices, such as County Council and Mayor's Cabinet. You can engage in constituent advocacy with elected officials that represent your district. And newly, we are talking to our members about working with litigation. So increasingly, we're seeing a shift from the legislature to the courts when we're dealing with some of these concerns. This is just a brief overview of what you can do, our presenters will talk a little bit more about this later. When you're meeting with your legislator, you just want to make sure to introduce yourself, bring your story, and fully discuss the issue. It's important to remember that you are the expert and that often they're working on 100 things at once. They are not as aware of the counseling profession or what is going on in the counseling space as you are. Definitely bring one-pagers. Bring data with you and stories about working with your clients, of course, within ethical parameters, and make sure you have a specific ask. Sign sign up to sponsor this legislation or whatever your ask might be. And you'll want to debrief with your team afterwards because you are going to want to follow up. So a lot of legislative work is just consistency and making sure that you have a good relationship with your legislators. So ACA Government Affairs works on a ton of different priorities. For federal priorities, we focused for a long time on Medicare reimbursement for LPCs. It is the primary insurance provider for approximately 60 million Americans, including adults over 65 and individuals with disabilities. These individuals cannot currently use Medicare to receive services from LPCs. After a decade of membership engagement and our team working with officials and with the executive, we have officially moved forward. It's a wonderful success. Congress voted to pass the $1.7 trillion fiscal year omnibus package, the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2023. Among the provisions including in the omnibus was the Mental Health Access Improvement Act, which does improve access to mental health services by permitting LPCs to be reimbursed by Medicare. Counselors will be eligible to enroll beginning January 1st, 2024. Our team will continue to engage on Medicare throughout 2023 and 2024. We'll collaborate with CMS to refine guidance for regulatory language that will help guide states in how to onboard this new program. We'll coordinate with CMS and ACA partners to ensure rollout is timely, engage licensed professional counselors in meetings and conversations around modernizing Medicare, and continue to advocate and educate in tandem with the Mental Health Workforce Coalition. We also focus on school-based mental health services, veterans affairs, social justice and social determinants of health, COVID-19 transitions, including telehealth, and career counseling. For more, please visit our legislative agenda at counseling.org. Our state agenda this year includes the Interstate Compact for Licensure. ACA funded the legislative project beginning in 2020 to allow counselors to practice across state lines. We anticipate the application for privileges to practice will be available in late 2023 or early 2024. We are currently at 28 states that have enacted this legislation, and we are very excited to announce that we will most likely reach 30 states by the end of the calendar year. To learn which states have enacted this legislation, please visit counselingcompact.org. In state work, we also look at social justice and social determinants of health, such as the Racism is a Public Health Crisis campaign. We work on LGBTQIA+ support, including conversion therapy bans, which has been a successful state-by-state movement banning the illegitimate practice known as conversion therapy. And we work with our branches to ensure ethical and educational standards meet current best practices. So what is the national standards for the profession, and how can we ensure that states are aligning and promoting this consistent standardization within the profession? We also strategically support counselor autonomy, client-doctor privacy, monitoring telebehavioral health, encouraging funding and appropriations for school-based counseling, promoting resources for critical community-based mental health programs, highlighting violence prevention, monitoring student loan repayment, expanding insurance coverage for mental health providers, including parity, supporting drug use disorder treatment programs, and prioritizing the military community. For more information on this, as well as how you can get involved, please visit counseling.org, Government Affairs Action Center. In addition, we have our annual federal and state this year, our annual Federal Hill Day next week. You can sign up on counseling.org as well, or to find out more about how to get involved in our Hill Day, please reach out to advocacy@counseling.org. That's advocacy@counseling.org. ACA celebrates our LGBTQIA+ counseling community. In addition to our annual Thrive sponsorship since inception with our Human Rights Campaign partner, our successful advocacy support of conversion therapy bans, which has grown into a movement across the country, and our active involvement with numerous national and state LGBTQIA+ policy coalitions, ACA has also compiled comprehensive resources to help counselors provide inclusive, culturally appropriate mental health care to the LGBTQIA+ community. We have also developed advocacy resources that allow counselors to navigate the legislative landscape as discriminatory laws threaten to roll back the rights of LGBTQ individuals across the country. On that note, I am so happy to introduce our SAIGE presenters. Jean is a PhD candidate at Ohio University. Their research and clinical practice focuses on trans and queer liberation, advocacy, and disability justice. Jean is the SAIGE Public Policy Committee Chairperson, the SAIGE Ohio Southeast Representative, and a CSJ Counselor Education and Supervision Task Force member. Leo Kanschneider is an openly queer and transgender clinical mental health counselor and is the current Legislative and Public Policy Committee Chair and President-elect for the American Counseling Association of Iowa and a SAIGE Public Policy Committee member.
So hello, Thanks for coming to the webinar. Thanks, Dominique, for your introduction. So let's talk about why we're here. The big reason we are having this PowerPoint presentation. So right now, we have more than 520 anti-LGBTQ bills in various states. We also have several at a national level, right? And this is the highest number we've ever had, and it's a pattern, right? Right now, most of these bills are directed at trans people for various reasons. A lot of it is focused at gender affirming care bans, which we'll talk more about, but this is a deadly issue for trans people. A lot of what is happening is a concerted effort by conservative groups, right? These are not problems that legislators are getting from their constituents. These are bills that are prepackaged with nearly identical language being sent from state to state. And that is why there are so many of them, and that is why it is so dangerous, right? This is not what democracy is supposed to look like. I will say that we are going to be talking about things here, but it's important to note that things vary from state to state. So do not take this as this is exactly what you should do. And if you have more questions, our contact information will be available. Leo, do you want to add anything to this?
I think just as we're going through this information, keep an open mind. I know some of these things, people may not see the broad scope of how this is impacting queer and trans individuals. I know from my own clinical practice that it is very detrimental to the mental health of my own clients, and I know Jean has seen a lot of the same. So please keep an open mind as we are talking about these issues. And like Jean said, if you have questions, we will have a Q&A at the end, and we will also make our contact information available if you want to chat more about any of this.
So there are a lot of different bills that have been introduced, and we cannot give you a rundown one by one because of how many there are and how quickly they are happening. This gives a broad view of what the major themes are. There are bills in various states that fall under multiple themes that are listed here, right? So limiting IDs, so that can be refusing gender marker changes or even name changes at a state level. Undermining non-discrimination laws, right? So if you've seen Florida's new law that says that you can refuse people care based on your beliefs, that falls under the non-discrimination laws. It also includes athlete bans that we're seeing in various states, many of which are passing. Restricting freedom of speech. This might include drag bans, but it also can include some of the non-discrimination pieces that we just talked about. So limiting different types of healthcare. It says here, gender affirming access for minors. I think it's really important to note that it is not just minors anymore. It started with minors and it is expanding out at a really dangerous rate. And it indicates that it wasn't ever just about trans kids, it was about trans people. Limiting public accommodations. This is partially the bathroom pieces, but it's also the trans athletes ban. One of the undercurrents of that is segregating locker rooms and all of those pieces. We are also seeing the censoring of curriculum. So the Don't Say Gay bills, the anti-CRT bills. When we see the censoring of curriculum, some of those bills also include the undermining non-discrimination pieces, right? So outing trans kids or queer kids, additional pieces around that, banning books, right? So these are themes, but there are bills that have all of these things in them simultaneously, and it's important to note that it's difficult to distill them down because of how much overlap there is.
Yeah, as we were kind of going through the legislation and looking at the types of bills that were introduced, we were kind of looking at what are the most common bills that are being introduced. So as Jean had noted, when I originally typed out this slide, I put, bans on affirming healthcare access for minors because that's what we had most commonly seen at that time. We're starting to see with a lot of these different types of bills, state legislators are seeing how far can we push this? Okay, so if we ban this for minors right now, can we maybe push it to, oh, we're going to ban this up to 21 to 25 with some of the education censoring of curriculum. We'll ban this through 3rd grade, 6th grade. Can we ban it K through 12? They'll see how far they can push some of these agendas and some of these laws, some of these bills to really show like Jean had said, it's not just about protection of minors, which is where a lot of these things have started, right? That protection of minors piece, but it's really, really important to note that these bills aren't going to stop until there is a loud enough voice to say stop.
And we've already noticed states that pass some of these things expanding them further, right? Florida is a really good example, but it's happening in other places too. And I think it's also important to note that, like, if we don't push back for this, it's going to keep going, right? When we're talking about especially limiting types of healthcare, they might be starting here, but let's think of how far that could go, right? There's a lot of healthcare that people need that other people might disagree with, and that's a dangerous precedence to set. I also think it's worth noting that a lot of the things that we heard in the 70s and 80s and 90s about gay people is just being repackaged to be said about trans people. And as the two main panelists here are trans people, I really want to emphasize that, right? They're using the exact same playbook. This isn't new. So there are a lot of implications of this legislation. Leo and I are both clinicians working in the field primarily with LGBTQ clients. We are seeing the harms of this directly, especially with the youth that I see. And I think Leo is also seeing that, especially with the kids, right? And Leo is actually in a state that's banned gender affirming care. This is creating trauma. We already struggled because of the way that we're treated in society. This legislation is not slowing that down. It is also creating higher rates of hate crimes and situations where people are not safe. Every time there is a queer event in my town, there are Nazis there to protest it, right? So we are seeing an increased need for counseling service because people are scared, and legitimately so, right? We are facing violence. We are facing terrorism. I know that might seem like a very extreme statement to some people, but when Nazis show up and bomb threats are made, that is terrorism, and there's no other word for it. Leo.
Yeah, it's also really important to note here, we are also seeing these implications in the advocacy work that we do. The advocacy work that we are doing is inherently traumatic for us right now. Because as we are advocating and as you consider what types of advocacy you can do, first and foremost, we need to think about our safety because of this. We need to think about our safety because there are threats of violence and acts of terrorism, because we know that as we are advocating, people are being doxxed, people are being followed home, people's families are being threatened. I know for myself, I have an out plan. How can I get myself and my family out of our home, out of an address that can be publicly released, into a safe place where we can stay should something like this happen? So I think that it's also really important to note that this isn't just impacting our clients, it's impacting our clients greatly. It's impacting our population as a whole greatly. It is also impacting our advocates.
Yeah. I think that's a really important point, Leo, because, right, I go to the Capitol and I testify on behalf of my state's counseling organization, but that is an incredible amount of emotional labor, and my name is on a public record And I do worry regularly about what that means for my career, what that means for my safety. I think that we get really bogged down in what this means for clients, that we don't necessarily look at the bigger picture of what this means for counselors, especially our queer and trans counselors. It's a struggle every day. So I would love it if there were ways that we could be better informed about these things, right? I keep track of it because it is my job, right? I'm the public policy committee chairperson for SAIGE. But I think that one of the very big barriers here is that most people don't follow this the way that I do. So I want to give you some resources on how you can do more of that. So follow your local news sources, right? Most more metropolitan areas have a queer newspaper, or it's not really a newspaper anymore, but it's an online newspaper, right? Following legislators that are pro LGBTQ, they will regularly provide updates for anti-LGBTQ bills. Queer and trans journalists are following this and they are writing about it, right? There are a number of folks who this is what they do for their whole job. They just follow the anti-LGBTQ bills and they write updates. They give you overviews of what the bills say, who is supporting them, all of those things. Your local teaching union almost certainly cares about the education restrictions and are working against them, right? That is not going to be true for everywhere. But I live in a very red state, and the teaching union here is very, very worried about the threats to education in the state because of the restrictions that are trying to be placed. If you look at your local and state organizations, that can be really useful. Maybe your state counseling division isn't doing much, but I promise you the social workers in your state are. MFTs, psychologists, school counselors, there are people who are in the mental health care field that are doing things, and they are frequently doing more than individuals because there are more people, and organizations can usually afford lobbyists. And if you can have a lobbyist on your side, that is an incredible advantage.
Yeah, I think kind of within this too, staying informed, staying connected is really going to help with another piece that we'll talk about, which is coalition building.
Absolutely.
So kind of as I'd mentioned, in staying informed, it's going to really, really help with this piece. When you are thinking about building coalitions, it's really important to be visible. Make it known to other people that you are here, you are doing the work, show up to events that are, legislative focused, show up to school board meetings to talk about some of these things to the extent that it is safe for you. Be visible and active in doing the work. It's really important to reach out and make tangible connections with other people. I think it can be great to say, oh, well, I haven't been contacted, so I really don't know what to do. Find people, send emails, reach out. It can be really, really helpful to connect, like Jean had mentioned, as far as following resources to connect with other professional organizations, connect with your school counseling organizations, connect with your other state counseling associations, your social workers, connect with healthcare providers. These are going to be people who you are going to want on your side and who you are going to want to see the perspective from. Don't be afraid to at least send an email, introduce yourself. That's actually a really good way to be visible as well. Is just to say, hey, this is what I'm seeing. I really want to connect and talk about this if you're open about it. You can also look to, so on Facebook, there is a provider group for Iowa that is open and affirming care providers or something like that, that is specific to LGBTQIA plus affirming healthcare providers and mental health care providers. So finding groups like that can be really useful as well as far as reaching out. It's really important to hold meetings, especially when you are looking at talking to legislators, creating those consistent, inclusive spaces, even just to talk about the impact that these concerns are having on those of us who are doing the work. Having that community space is really, really important. share resources, information, knowledge. That is what gets us going and gives us the tools that we need to effectively talk to our legislators about what's going on. If we aren't sharing the resources and information that we have, we may be going into some of these conversations with legislators with unintentionally different information, which is just going to confuse our legislators. It's important that we're going into this with the same information on the same playing field. Sharing those resources is super important. It's also really important to connect with LGBTQ+ led organizations. Listen to the people who are being impacted most by this legislation. Listen to your queer and trans counselors. Listen to queer and trans folks in the state. There are going to be state organizations in Iowa here. We have Iowa Safe Schools and One Iowa that do a lot of this work that are queer and trans led organizations that know the implications of this on a broader scale than just our counseling lens that we will be coming into this with. It is so important to listen to those voices as we are advocating. Jean, do you have anything to add on building coalitions?
Yeah, if you are someone who has the ability to show up to the state house when these bills are being heard in committee, that is a great place to meet people who care about these issues, who want to work with you, right? I have formed invaluable connections by being there in community, providing my testimony, and right, recently we had a hearing for our gender affirming care ban in Ohio. The psychologists went first, and one of the things they said was it wasn't inaccurate, but it didn't fully encompass the rules that we have in the state. So one of the benefits is that our social work organization was there, and I met up with them in the moments between us testifying to talk about what we wanted to clarify about that to the committee, right? So you meet other organizations, you also meet trans kids, you meet their parents, you meet doctors, you meet pastors, everybody who shows up from various organizations. It is terrible that we have to show up to the Capitol for these hearings, but it is beautiful, the community that can be found there and the way you can connect with people who care about these issues the way that you do. I also really want to emphasize what Leo said about listening to queer people and trans people about these issues. We love our allies, but there are moments when they are not speaking from what we are experiencing. It's their perspective of a queer issue, and that can be valuable, but frequently it is not what we need. And I want you to ask people what they actually need when they're doing advocacy if you're not part of that community. We have position statements as SAIGE. We have a number of them. And in fact, we recently passed another through our executive board about drag bans. We also have several more coming. One of the things that we are doing as a committee is writing these statements, getting them through our board, and then posting them so that people have resources to do advocacy, right? Like, this is a legitimate counseling organization and this is what they say. It gives you the language and the resources to make statements yourself. Is also an important piece that we're not just making statements. We are working actively on these issues as a committee, as an organization. So these are accessible to you through our website. It's actually on multiple parts of our website. And if you have trouble finding them, again, reach out. I would be happy to send you each and every one of them. And it is also in the chat for our participants. Additional thoughts, Leo?
Yeah, I think it's so important to note that when we are talking about position statements, there are sometimes people who will roll their eyes and say, oh, position statement is just words. It's, you know, not really doing anything actionable. But we take many actionable steps after releasing these position statements. They give us tools when writing legislators, when having conversations, providing testimony. Again, it is getting everybody on the same page with what we're needing, with what we're saying. And it's also saying, hey, I have a state level organization, a national level organization behind me in saying this. So this isn't just me. This is also this organization, this association. ACA of Iowa has released a couple of our own position statements as well, in addition to the SAIGE position statements that I have used in my own testimony and when writing my own legislators. It can be a very, very valuable tool to use when you're working with your legislators on this issue.
Especially if you're worried about the language that you're using when you're writing your legislators. You can just use ours. We're happy for you to do that. You don't even have to credit us if you don't need to. So we have a lot of resources. So we do have the position statements that you now have links to. We also have our competencies for working with the LGB plus stuff and also trans focused competencies. We are also working on updating some of those competencies now in our own committees with SAIGE. The ACLU has some good resources. Lambda Legal has good resources. It's important to note that SAIGE's competencies are also ACA competencies. ACA has endorsed them. ACA also has their advocacy competencies, which are valuable. WPATH, which is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, has the standards of care. There are multiple iterations. The most recent one is 8. There are definitely other organizations that have resources. I want to encourage you to check out the American Psychological Association's resources from Division, I believe it's 44. But on their website, you can, if you just type in APA LGBTQ, you will absolutely find a number of resources that we have used in our own statements for, like, how do we link to sources? Where do people stand on this issue? They're very thorough.
Yeah, I think, again, when thinking about resources as well, these are just some of the national resources that we have. Also look to the state level. So ACLU has a branch in almost every state that you can reach out to. I can reach out to ACLU of Iowa and say, hey, this is what I'm seeing here. And they are actually going to be the most up to date on Iowa specific legislation and what we are doing here in our state to fight that legislation. So in addition to looking at some of these broader national level resources, Google what's available in your state. And if you don't know, it can be really useful to find a university that has an LGBTQ health center. So in Iowa's University of Iowa has an LGBTQ health center, and they actually have been an excellent tool to help with resource gathering and finding some of those connections and, you know, getting me into some of those pieces. So if you aren't sure where to go, find affirming care providers, find an affirming university system, and they will likely be able to point you in the direction of some of those resources as well.
Yeah, ACLU Ohio has been an incredible resource. I had lunch with one of their folks very recently. I will also say the Equality Federation. They are a good organization broadly, and they have offices in most states that are doing good work. And actually, they keep track of the bills on a website for the Equality Federation. That's very useful. So state level resources are really valuable, and most of the big universities have LGBT centers that have information and resources for their students that they're willing to share with you.
Yes, and adding to the resources, I want to do a shout out to the Human Rights Campaign. The American Counseling Association often partners with them, and they do have regional offices and state folks on the ground who work on policy as well. Their state, the director of their state programs is fantastic. So there are so many resources, and if you have any further questions about how to connect with them, please don't hesitate to reach out to ACA through advocacy@counseling.org. I also want to sincerely thank our presenters before we go to the Q&A. Please hang on for the Q&A. That was a very powerful presentation. It is critically important right now that we focus on these issues. So I really am deeply thankful, and we are so happy to be able to host you today. So let's go to the Q&A. I want to highlight that in the chat box, we were asked if there will be a link to the recorded presentation that this person is a student and wants to share with other students in their counseling program. I went ahead and answered that yes, we will be sharing the PowerPoint. We will be sharing further resources, so keep an eye out for that. So in beginning our Q&A, I just want to very briefly touch on some intro level informationals. So in looking at our PowerPoint, we used a new modern iteration of LGBTQIA+. I just wanted to make sure folks are aware of what those titles represent and the full spectrum of our community, as well as what the difference is between sexual orientation and gender identity.
So LGBTQIA is lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, intersex, and the A is not, it's not for ally, y'all are great, but the A is for asexual or aromantic or agender, right? People who are part of the community really would like the acronym to be for us. The plus is for literally everyone else. It's really important to know that LGBTQIA+, it's an umbrella term. Anyone who exists outside of heterosexual and cisgender norms and would like to be included in that label, they're part of it, right? This is not meant to be exclusionary. It's why I generally use the word queer, because I think that that's a better umbrella term. Sexual orientation is about who you are attracted to, whether that's romantically, whether that's physically, right? It is who you are with other people in some ways, right? And you can be we're not going to talk about everything here, but like, we're doing a brief overview. So if you want more about that, please come to a SAIGE webinar. We've got a lot of resources. I will say that gender identity is about gender, not sexuality. Those things can be very independent of each other, right? Many trans people continue to have the same sexual orientation after they transition. It's just now they are a different gender, so the words for their sexuality have changed, right? A trans woman might now be a lesbian because she is still interested in women. So these are distinct categories, and the experiences that we have because of them can be very distinct. Coming out as queer is very different from coming out as trans. Anything you'd like to add, Leo?
Yeah, I think just highlighting the SAIGE website has a lot of excellent resources on initialism and kind of LGBTQIA+ vocabulary in general. So please check out sagecounseling.org. There's also the book Affirming Counseling for LGBTQI+ People by Misty Nicola and colleagues that talks about a lot of these concepts as well.
You can buy that on the ACA bookstore.
Thank you so much. That was really informative. So thank you. An audience member has asked, how would you recommend balancing being visible and advocating and trauma and burnout?
Hard. It's really, really hard. I wish I had a clear, concise answer for you, but there's not one, right? It differs from person to person, what visibility means to them, the consequences of that visibility. I think that, right, we have a lot of talking points about self-care, but I want to encourage you towards community care. This is a collective trauma that we are all experiencing. The best way to heal it is not by yourself, it is in community with other queer and trans folks, right? We are struggling, and it's hard because even when you're burnt out, it keeps moving, right? The bills don't stop. I think that another piece of that is the community piece, because at some point you're going to need to step back, and it will be great if there's someone else there to step forward. Set boundaries where you need to, recognize that what you can give is not the same every single day. It's hard. I wish I had a better answer.
Yeah, much to echo Jean, I think it's really important to acknowledge that we can't do this alone. As much as we would love to say that, I myself am going to go out and be a really great advocate and do all of this work, social justice work is traumatic. So it is incredibly important to lean on community, to lean on other people for support. Jean, do you want to talk about what the SAIGE Public Policy Committee has going on as far as community support goes?
So if you are a SAIGE member, this summer we are having a couple meetings to offer space to people who are struggling. So our counselors that are dealing with these legislative attacks, with the consequences of it for our clients, just kind of the feelings of hopelessness that a lot of us are experiencing, right? So we will be sending out information for that probably tomorrow. There will be at least 3 different meetings. If there's a lot of people that come, we can set up more times. It's going to be about 90 minutes of just talking about what we're dealing with, spending time in community, maybe connecting folks that are in the same states or in the same areas so that they can care for each other, right? These are really difficult times, and we're trying to create a gathering spot so that people, right, we're struggling, but we're struggling together, and it's easier when we're doing it together.
That's a phenomenal answer. I really appreciate that you're holding that space. And a lot of the social justice work we do, that is what we tell folks, is community is so important. It's the only way that you can carry this. So thank you so much for that answer. In line with this question, another member of the audience asked, as a parent of transgender youth and a clinician that works with this population, I'm finding myself exhausted and frightened. What suggestions do you have for self-care when doing this job and this work?
So we all kind of came into this field with coping skills and coping strategies. It's one of the things that they make sure we understand in school. I think that it's really important to note that as this is happening, we have to develop additional coping skills because the amount of stress we're under has radically escalated. So finding new coping skills, finding ways to carve out time for yourself, for your family, the things that you have always done are really useful, but they're not going to be enough anymore. This is very much an individual basis sort of thing. What works for you, what doesn't work for you. Leo, additional thoughts?
Yeah, I think for me, what has been most important is carving out intentional time to step away from the work. So there have been times that I've texted Jean and said, hey, I'm taking a break, I'm taking a vacation, I'm not doing anything related to this weekend, so if you need me, don't. I will get back to you on Monday. And taking those intentional breaks has been incredibly important because I myself, as Jean had mentioned, I am transgender, and I work with this population. So I am constantly feeling all of this myself. And there are times that I do just need to step away.
Yeah.
Really, really great answers. Thank you. And there was a quick question in line of Leo, our previous question, you mentioned the title of a book, and the audience member was hoping to have that repeated.
Yeah, so it is Affirming Counseling with LGBTQI plus individuals, or LGBTQI plus people, by Nicola Smith and Phil Moore. Grab it off my bookshelf here.
There is a copy on my bookshelf as well.
Thank you so much.
It's a great
Leo.
book. It is a great book. Love it.
Great, thank you so much. And going back to the trauma, the hardship of this work, that seems to be an overall theme we're seeing from the audience. So some questions on that. Do you know of any good virtual communities for LGBTQ plus counselors for those of us who may be more geographically isolated?
Yeah, so if you have a state branch of SAIGE, that could be really useful. I think that there are various places that you can do that with social media. I am very old, so I am on Facebook still, and there are Facebook groups specifically for LGBTQ counselors where we're dealing with some of this. I'm also part of groups that are specifically for trans counselors. Twitter is a terribly toxic place, but it is also a place where there are a lot of counselors who are doing this work, and you can connect with them there. I don't have Instagram, but I imagine that that's a thing there as well. Discord servers, You're going to have to look around, and unfortunately, it's entirely possible that you're going to have to make your own. That's an unfortunate piece of this work. There's a lot of ways that like we have to be the leaders of it as queer people, because there's not existing spaces and structures for us, because this space wasn't built for us, right? There was a really long time that queer counselors didn't exist because it was seen as a mental illness, right?
Yeah, I think online spaces is really just search and find and do what you can there. And as Jean said, create spaces as necessary. And I think that goes along with coalition building. The more you can connect with others, the more you can build those spaces.
Great, thank you so much. And I want to do a shout out to our online space on ACA Connect, where you can connect with other counselors and connect with your branches and divisions, learn about the work they're doing, talk with them about issues in your state. That was a phenomenal answer. Thank you. So another question that is in the chat: as a therapist who works with LGBTQIA+ youth teens, I come across situations where their parents are not supportive, not allowing them to attend Pride or take part in events. What is your approach to this? What are effective ways of being supportive in this situation?
It's hard, right? Because depending on the age of your teenager, no matter what, they probably live with their parents, and you probably need a certain level of consent from parents to be treating them, right? You have to balance the kids' need for autonomy and that we're supposed to be helping them be autonomous. It's one of the points of seeing youth as a clinician, with also making sure that they continue to stay safe in their home, right? And that can be a very difficult balance to strike if you are working with a kid whose parent is not affirming. Depending on that teenager's preference, right? You don't talk to parents without talking to a teenager first, unless it's like an immediate healthcare thing, right? Like they're in danger. Seeing if they want you to talk to the parent and have a gentle, kind conversation about it. There can be ways of talking with parents that are not supportive in a way that's like, okay, but what's the harm in letting your kid participate in this, right? If you think it's a phase, why not let them engage in that phase? My mother let me be emo in high school. I have regrets about it, but she doesn't, right? It gave me the opportunity for self-expression and identity development, and realizing like, oh, I think I actually just want to dress like a librarian. So there are conversations that can be had in that way, but there's also the likelihood that in some places, if you try to have that conversation, that kid is not going to be able to continue counseling. So I want you to trust your professional judgment. I want you to be an advocate in the ways that you can be, but know the limits of your advocacy. We cannot endanger our clients. And it's hard to know what the right answer is. And there's going to be a situation where you're wrong and it's going to hurt. Do your best to navigate it with grace. Make sure that you have the full consent of the kiddo that you are counseling.
Yeah, I think protection and safety is going to be your number one priority. Making sure that you are keeping the best interest of your client in mind is going to be your number one concern and priority. With that, there have been times that I have provided a significant amount of education to parents. I will sit down with them and their kiddo in session and talk to them about what gender affirming care means and how, accessing that, and talk to them about the research. Familiarize yourself with the literature and the research. Familiarize yourself with the competencies so you can have accurate psychoeducational conversations with the parents that's backed up by our research, that's backed up by our professional knowledge base. I think that in and of itself can be super important and critical if the parent is at least open enough to sit down and have that conversation. And that's a big if.
There's a lot of myths about trans affirming care, and it's sitting down and talking to a parent about what it actually is generally speaking, they're much happier about it and what it looks like once you have that conversation.
Great, thank you both so much. And, you know, at ACA, we are watching this as well in legislation come up, the issue of focusing on minors, and in looking at the trend of growing depression and suicide among youth as well. It's such a timely question, so thank you for talking about it. So I also want to point out that someone in the chat listed a link to the book you shared, as well as numerous folks saying thank you for attending before I go on. Thank you for presenting before I go on. We have a couple of questions specifically about legislation. So one of the attendees is asking what potential logic these groups are using to push anti-LGBTQIA efforts. What are the arguments that you're seeing out there for some of these bills?
The biggest one is protecting children, which has always been what people hide behind when we're talking about LGBTQ issues, right? When we look at the bans for various types of books and things in classrooms, a lot of them are not framed as LGBTQ, they're framed as explicit sexual content. Being queer is not explicitly sexual. And I think that can be a really important point to make, right? This isn't actually about protecting kids. That's not what it's ever been about. It's about deciding who gets to be in public spaces. While it is absolutely okay to walk into these spaces and try to dispel these myths, most of the people pushing this know what it actually is, right? So you're not going to change their opinion in a lot of the spaces, right? What it is important to do from my work as an advocate and kind of showing up to the Capitol is to very clearly point out that this is scaremongering, right? This is not in any way accurate. It does not reflect what is happening. That doesn't always move the needle, but I think sometimes it's really important to note to people that this is not the intention of it, to call out the bad behavior and the bad faith efforts.
I think in addition to the protecting the children and like protecting our women and children, I think has also been a pretty big one, particularly in regards to the athlete bans and the bathroom bills, protecting our women and children, so protecting our vulnerable populations. I think in addition to that, there is a lot of backing where a lot of conservative individuals and groups are going to be voting for legislators who are passing and introducing this type of legislation because that's what they think they want to see. And so I think in addition to the protecting our women and children, a lot of it too is how can we get reelected? And getting reelected is, you know, this is going to be part of my plan to get reelected is going to be to speak on these issues in a negative light and to, you know, try to pass this harmful legislation. So I think that's another part of it too.
Also would like to encourage you to vote.
Yeah, please vote.
Absolutely, please vote. Great, thank you so much. And you know, what we've seen at ACA also is, you know, just decades of working on these bills. Some of these bills are just a continuation of a conversation or discourse that has been going on for a while, that's been pushed by a handful of think tanks and key leaders across the nation. So they really do think, like, what is the easiest way to get this bill across? How do we establish precedent so that we can then build on this to make further discriminatory bills and laws? So one way that you're seeing this is in Florida with the bathroom bills. You see like how originally some of these bills are passed to protect, quote unquote, but then the actual application of the law becomes basically anyone they think doesn't look feminine enough or masculine enough, and then expanding the bill language further or applying it in a very broad way. So it's obvious, as you said, that it's not, you know, protective. So thank you for explaining that. So another question from an audience member is, I've been trying to stay informed, have sought out my board, Kentucky Counseling Board, Kentucky LPAT Board, and both stated that they cannot give legal advice, they cannot, and refuse to give any other advice. Any other suggestions of who to reach out to help understand these terrifying laws, especially the ones that include mental health workers in their restrictions?
So first, I want to invite you to email me publicpolicy@SAIGE, SAIGE, counseling.org with those questions. You are very close to Ohio, and I'm part of SAIGE Ohio, so I could connect you there. I think that either you are asking very different questions than I think you're asking, or they're kind of trying to dodge you. So I'd be more than happy to connect you with your neighbors in Ohio who are doing this work. And if we know that people in Kentucky aren't getting support, maybe we can develop resources specifically for Kentucky.
Right. And that email address is publicpolicysage@counseling.org.
Publicpolicy@sagecounseling.org. And SAIGE is SAIGE.
So I'm typing this in the chat for you as well, folks, so you can just copy and paste it.
Yeah, I was going to try to throw it in the chat, but I can only send to hosts and panelists. There's not one for everybody.
Yeah. So in wrapping up, I want to ask this great question. What are the top 3 things you'd want new counselors entering the field to know regarding holding safe spaces for queer and trans clients and counselors, as well as advocacy steps you'd want them taking? My thoughts are that they're younger and fresher and can do some of the heavier lifting of this work.
So I agree to some of that, right? Younger, fresher, perhaps more informed about queer issues, right? But Leo and I are still very new to the field, right? I have I'm like fully licensed in my state, but I'm about to finish a doctoral program. I am not yet an assistant professor. I will be in September. Leo is just recently graduated from his counseling program. It is very difficult to be brand new and doing all of this work, and it's terrifying that the old guard isn't doing it, right? So I definitely want to encourage new folks to be very active in this, but I also want to encourage folks who are older professionals who have been doing this for a while to offer us support and guidance on how to do that, because you're role models, right? And right now we are not having the role models that we need and deserve. I will say it starts with internal work, right? If you are not queer or trans, or even if you are, right, there's a lot of internal bias. Start there, reach out. Also, right, like you have to hold space for people publicly, but you have to stand up for us privately. What are you saying? What are you doing when we are not looking? Because if you're not doing this when we're not looking, you're not actually an ally.
Yeah, I think my top 3 are really like inform yourself first on the LGBTQI+ community and queer and trans issues. Talk to queer and trans people directly, and especially queer and trans professionals who are doing this work. Get to know what we are doing, what we are saying, because our voices are the ones that matter. Our voices are the ones that need to be lifted up. And then the third is look internally at what your organization is doing. I think starting at an organizational level, as far as advocacy goes, is a lot more accessible than what Jean and I are doing at the state and national level.
Yeah.
Start at the organizational level and work up from there.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's great advice. And in the chat, they talked about building coalitions, why coalitions are important. I want to read what Leo said, which is that building coalitions is incredibly important because there's a lot of strength in numbers. The more we can show our legislators that there are a number of us who are advocating on these issues, the more likely they are to listen. And I will note that in these past couple of sessions, we are having, an unusual partisan climate that is traditional advocacy approaches are just not working. In the states where we have had effective pushback against some of these laws, it has been due solely based on coalition work, folks coming and filling testimony rooms to capacity, folks working across broad coalitions. So thank you for that answer as well, Leo. So in wrapping up today, because we are out of time, we've had so much participation from the audience. Do you have any last advice for the communities or allies today?
If you don't know how to do this, absolutely connect to other people, see what other people are doing. We can be those people at SAIGE. Also, the questions that you asked, if we did not get to them, we will be answering them in writing and we will be sending them out to folks. So don't worry if your question didn't get answered. We do care, we will answer it.
Yeah, and I think kind of as you are listening and thinking and doing some of the internal work, don't be afraid to ask yourself the hard questions. If you have inadvertently perpetuated harm, don't beat yourself up, learn from that and grow from that. We are all on a learning journey together. We can all grow as a group. We are growing as a counseling field, as a profession. It's okay that we have messed up. Learn, listen, and do better next time. I'm so appreciative of everyone who's been here today, so thank you.
Thank you both so much. And a reminder that ACA's Hill Day is coming up next week. Please go to counseling.org for more information. For questions, advocacy@counseling.org. Thank you both so much for your time today.
Thank you.
Bye.